we've sort of divided it up into fur, skins, and feathers. The exhibition that we're here in conjunction with is primarily about birds, of course, but we thought the museum, the mandate of the museum was broader than that, so it would be appropriate for us to explore other possibilities. Not leopard, panther. She bought it. The woman I got it from bought it at an auction sale in Toronto. It has a Toronto label in it. The woman that I got it from worked at the auction house, and they couldn't get anybody to bid on it because they thought it was too creepy. She bought it, wore it a couple of times, and then her own sense of what was right and wrong got in the way. So she wouldn't wear it again. Now, I think the difference is that the rosettes in panther, the rosettes, each of the little medallions is referred to as a rosette. The rosettes are larger than they'll be in leopard or other spotted cat. This, as far as I know, is leopard. And you can see the difference between the two. Actually, sorry Gerhard, but since we actually have this thing here, it goes a little bit pixelated there, but that gives you a different sense of the size and texture of the fur. This is out of Claus's collections. The coat was made in Berlin in the late 30s. The pockets are made out of colobus monkey fur, which is doubly creepy because it looks like human hair. So it looks a bit like you're wearing scalps. This is colobus monkey fur that's been dyed sapphire blue. I got this from an estate sale down by Kitts Beach. The woman had this same stole in gray and in black. She had an ankle-length black monkey fur cape. She had elbow-length monkey fur cape, and she had a hip-length monkey fur jacket.
Wow.
And I hate to tell you this, but the labels are all Foster's Furriers, Vancouver. These are actually made here. It's wonderful, but horrible. So that will be the mode of the day, I'm afraid. At one of the classes, I think it was one of the classes, someone left this for me. And since we're talking about exploitation of animals, sealskin with the matching beanie and the matching gloves. And inside was a miniature baby seal. I find it particularly eccentric when people are killing one animal to make another one. It's really weird. So that's the leopard. Eel skin, which is fairly conventional nowadays and not an endangered species, but that's going to be from the 70s. This I got, let me just see if I've put his name in here. I got this from one of our continuing education students for UBC here, and I don't think I've put his name on here. Anyway, this is from a company called Skincraft in Nairobi, Republic of Kenya. This is an export permit from March of 1978 for the fellow's sister to take that out of Nairobi because that's lion skin. They were South Asian descent, and they had to leave because of Idi Amin and the other issues associated with politics. So I assume that because of that expediency, that was one of the reasons she was allowed to take that out of the country. Anyway, that's lion. Not attractive, broken as a matter of fact, I just noticed that last night. Turtle skin. And I thought, turtles? Turtles don't have skin, they have shells. Well, of course they have skin. The junction between the head and the legs and so on and so forth. That's all turtle skin, and I got that in the Sally Ann 40 years ago, and inside it says Tortuga something or other. Anyway, it's true turtle skin for that. This one. Nope, sorry. Handbag from the 20s, and that was described to me as sharkskin. I think it's skate or one of the other. Does that sound reasonable to somebody? Stingray. Very hard. Handy if you're mad at someone. You just hit them with that and you'll remove 3 or 4 layers of skin because it is truly like sandpaper. This is what shagreen is made from, only they sand it down to make it smooth and then dye it green. So you've seen very expensive wallets and etui in little cases like that. Lizard skin, Art Deco, 1920s. I think it's French, I'm not sure offhand, but very, just have a look here, no, it doesn't tell me offhand. Anyway, so that's lizard. This is out of Claus's collection, and we can't tell if somebody knows the difference between crocodile and alligator. The only way I can tell is the crocodile rhymes with the Nile, so we know it's African. Okay, the ever popular, ever ugly armadillo handbag. Now, why would you do this? This is about attracting attention, but what kind of attention? Then, just to show you that neither gender is guiltless, men's shoes, late 40s, early 50s, crepe soled, really heavy-duty snakeskin, very, very large scales. Wonderful shoes, but questionable taste, shall we say. These are more snake here. These are from Berlin. These are a company called Meschler from Berlin from the 1930s. These belong to a woman who had, in the 20s, been a chorus girl in Berlin, and at the end of her life, she was a countess living in New England. Showgirl who made well. Now, I brought a fair amount of these. These are real whalebone. If you can circulate those around. Whalebone, or baleen, grows from the roof of the whale's mouth in plates that are in series. And if you think of a sort of a combination of something halfway between fingernails and hair. So they're fibrous, but they're solid at the same time. There's some sort of element there that binds them together and makes the fibers appear as a solid item. The advantage to them for fashion is that whalebone will split the length of the fiber, the hair element in there, and they are flexible. They will take a fair amount of strain, and in corsets in particular they were valuable because the heat of the body will cause them to soften slightly, and over a period of time they will actually adapt themselves slightly to the natural body shape. So this means eventually the corset will become more and more comfortable. It also means that in the long run they very rarely washed their corsets, because once you washed them, especially if you used hot water, you'd lose the form. So I have an article written in the 1930s about a woman who was apprenticing as a corset maker, and they had clients bringing in corsets to have them repaired that hadn't been washed in 30 years. So one of the first uses for whalebone in fashion that is recorded anyway is in medieval shoes, the shoes that had the very long pointed toes to them. They used the baleen to support that long point and help with the curl. Now, as I say, whalebone is flexible and slightly alterable because of the heat. This is a parasol, which I can show you better afterwards. This is from the 1830s. I'm going to show you a slide that shows one virtually identical. But each of those, of the ribs in the parasol itself, are whalebone. So you can see the length of the plates there. They do have some. I don't know if there's any on display, but the first time we came out to have a look at the museum, there was one of the staff doing a display and a talk right out in the lobby here, talking about exactly this kind of thing. There is the oldest umbrella I've ever seen here anyway, is at the Museum of Vancouver. It's Scottish, and it's actually got an inscription on the handle, and it's from something like 1787. And it's for a man, I suspect, because it's very heavy, and the strips are actually about 1 inch wide. It's really quite remarkable. The whole thing probably weighs about 15 pounds. Anyway, that one is much more fashionable and designed to be carried by a woman. The handle and the tips are ivory, and that's a whole other subject, of course. The original handle in the illustration I show you, there should have been a hook on here also carved out of ivory. If not ivory, the lower quality ones would be bone. And just to make the point again, this is from the 1850s. We can't see the boning, but they are well boned. If you peek in between the linings, you can see that. But just to make the point about ivory being that much more sort of everywhere. This is the handle will break like that so that you can fold it up and put it in your hand. Carry it like that. Anyway, you get the idea. Like that. There we go. And just think about other animal parts. Things you might not have thought of initially anyway as being living creatures that are sacrificed for the world of fashion. Coral, and especially the really deep red coral. These are objects that were given to me by John Stott, who actually lives in the building, apartment building that Claus is in. These were in his mother's things, in fact. No, I guess John gave them to me, not Rosemary. Anyway, these Rosemary got from an aunt of hers who, the family tradition says, got them from Sarah Bernhardt. So, if any of you is under 40, you won't know who Sarah Bernhardt is. You'd be surprised. Anyway, Sarah Bernhardt, in her day, was probably the most important actress in the world. She played in Vancouver, actually, 3 different times. French actress. Anyway, these supposedly came from her. The necklace has been restrung, so the pearls are not original. Rosemary felt the necklace was too short for her to wear, so she wanted it longer. But my point with that, although it's not the living animal, it's the home that the animal makes for itself to exist in. And now, because that coral was so desirable, it's on the endangered, that kind of coral's on the endangered species list, I believe, and it's illegal to sell that, at least as a new product. The little stick pin there is a beetle casing, a scarab beetle, or I don't think it's scarab, but one of the beetles. As we go through this, in the 1870s and 80s, little animal parts were very popular as decorations on dresses, jewelry, ornaments in the hair, and the like. So then I brought a couple of pieces of feather ornaments for hats. That's Ostrich Feather. Oftentimes these were on enormous hats, and when the hat went out of style, because it was so hard to keep, because it took up so much volume, they'd savage the trims off it and throw the form away. So in fact I have several boxes of things like that. I don't know what kind of feather that is, and in fact it was kind of an accident that I brought it, but I just thought it was an interesting variation on a theme. Dyed, obviously. I don't think it's been reshaped particularly, but that would be common. The birds are the feathers are raw materials, and they're reinvented essentially by the designer. That is swan's down. This is made from swan skin. The swan has to be dead to do this, because I don't know if you can see it. On rare occasions, you will find someone has sort of manufactured it. They've taken bits of the down and they've sewn them down in little clumps to create trim for something like a baby's cape. In fact, it was either this or I have a baby's cape that I was going to bring, but I thought the swan's down. This way, if you handle it, I'm not going to be upset. you handle it on the garment, I'm going to be mad at you. I haven't got that many friends left. I can afford to lose any more, so let's stay friends. And this is an ostrich feather. Ostrich feathers are probably the most common, or maybe not the most common, but the most, the kind of feather that comes to mind first if you're thinking about trim. Domestic fowl are going to be the sources for most things like these hats here. Chickens, ducks, pheasants, and things, birds that can be raised. Ostrich can be raised as well. Also, to create the, to harvest the feathers, you don't need to kill the bird. Nowadays, of course, ostrich skin is being used. The eggs have been used as ornaments for centuries, but the feathers can be harvested, as I said, without harm to the bird. The large black hat that's in one of the cases at the far end of the building here has feathers like this. These are called weepers, or in French, pleureuses, which I think sounds much more wonderful. And these have actually been, there are several quills that have been bound together here to create extra lushness to the plume. And each of the flues, now I think there's a proper name for this, but I call them flues. This is the quill and these are the flues. Each of them has been knotted right there. So they've cut the flues off a different plume, tied them in one at a time to create that extra wick, extra drop. And I have feathers that have that 5 times. That's one of the reasons that plumes like that were so incredibly expensive. You might actually have a hat, the form would have cost $3 in 1910, but the plumes were selling for $150 or $200. So they were seen as valuable, and rightly so, because they are beautiful. Then an assortment of, well, 3 little hats here, which are going to be from the 1960s, the mid-1960s, the flower pot shapes. This one made with pheasant feathers. This one is probably chicken feathers, which have been dyed and manipulated and so on. Bloody awful, I think. I think it's really ugly, but that's not why I have it. Anyway, this is by Molly Entwistle. All any of you that's in long-term Vancouverite might know her. That's its original box there. Anyway, Molly was the grand dame of the millinery world here in the 60s and 70s. She was the last of the milliners to still stay in production. And incidentally, she was the first woman to be decorated by the Canadian military during the Second World War. Not for her hats. It's another story. And this one, I brought this one. This is by a company called Strathmore, big American company. Anyway, I got this from a woman named Jane Stone, who was a fashion model here in the 50s and 60s. And I just thought this is interesting too. This is rooster feathers here, and it really just takes on the appearance of a whole head of hair. It's almost like a wig. Okay, this one I neglected to point out, which is kind of fine because in a way our first slide deals with this. This is ermine. So this is real ermine. The winter coat, the summer coat will be brown, and then it's referred to as stoat. So it's a form of weasel or I'm not a biologist, so I'm probably getting myself into trouble with that one. But it's like mink or any of the other animals that so often are harvested for their fur. Okay.
The white hat.
Pardon me?
The white hat.
Oh, that one, yeah, I'm sorry, you're right. So I tried to put them chronologically, and then of course I missed this one. This is going to be the mid to late 1950s. Sits right on the top of the head, very sort of space age flying saucer kind of thing. Anyway, it is marabou, which is another water bird. My favorite thing with that is I was talking to somebody years ago, a fellow who was not interested in vintage clothing, and I said I had a hat of marabou, and he said, "I'm sorry, I don't know who that is." He thought I was saying it was by a woman named Mary Boo. So, oh, I am out of it here. Okay, this is about somewhere between maybe as early as 1909 and as late as 1912, but at this moment in history, the hats were enormous. skirts were getting narrow. I'll show you some slides for this. And the hat's huge, and a huge opportunity as well to show off trim. And in this instance, I got this hat from a woman named Maureen Timkew. Maureen's on the board of the Rhodey House Museum, and she asked us to do programs for them, and this was one of the things that she gave me in appreciation. So I don't think it's a real dove, but it's meant to look like one, so someone has built that. The core would have been probably something like a cotton batten that's been squished and maybe bound with tape or whatever, and then covered piecemeal with the feathers and so on, creating, in this instance, perhaps the appearance of a dove, but sometimes the birds are fantastic. They are not an option that would exist in nature. They'll use feathers from half a dozen different birds. But I'll show you, this one looks pretty zany, but mostly because it's big and appears to have a dead animal on it. But some of them are even more peculiar than that. That is Louis XIV dressed in ermine. Now, ermine would have been important for a royal person to wear because it was expensive. The animal is small. You have to hunt it in the winter. And he's showing off because each of those little black spots is supposed to be another tail. Because the animal itself, the bulk of the body is white, and the only part which is going to be black is the tip of the tail. So every little black dot means yet another animal. It's also interesting to me, the late 17th century and the early part of the 18th century, the clothing tends to be rather elaborate and have a lot of bulk to it. I think that's handy if you're fat, because you don't notice. In fact, the only part of his physique which is exposed is his legs. And so he's supposed to be looking kind of forceful and sexy and powerful and all that kind of stuff. But that's also partly by association with all those animals. He is using the value associated with those critters as part of his costume, proving his ability. And this is, I'm sorry for the quality of the slide, this is Madame de Montespan, his mistress of many years. They had 7 children together, and her robe is also lined in ermine. Now, I tend to worry about living up to people's expectations, so I overdo things. So forgive me if I seem to be straining the logic here a little bit. But this is an English painting from the 1740s. I put this in just to draw attention to the fact that his jacket is going to be made out of doeskin. And this was a very popular hunting garment. Again, I think that's a bit twisted, where you're wearing the dead animal that you're going to hunt for. These can be quite spectacular, and oftentimes they're actually hand-tooled with pattern and texture as well to create an extra element of luxury to them. A friend has some sterling silver buttons that were from one of his ancestors, a hunting jacket just like this, English, and each of the buttons is the portrait of one of his hunting dogs. Absolutely spectacular. Unfortunately, he won't let me have them, but I can see the point. But this was appropriate recreation for a man of privilege, and having the appropriate garment is part of that. In fact, there's the dog. One of his dogs was called Fairmaid, and Fairmaid is another name for one of those flowers in my front yard.
Snowdrops?
Snowdrops. So I thought that was kind of charming. So one of his pups was called Snowdrop. So this is the kind of undergarment that went under her skirt. This is a panier, and these are generally stiffened with whalebone. So what would happen is, where you see that channel through there would be whalebone pieces that have to be laminated together. That one garment there would take a fair amount of whalebone, but we're talking about a whole culture of this kind of apparatus. So there would have been thousands of women who had this kind of foundation garment for their most fashionable garments. Poor people, of course, wouldn't have had that opportunity. A substitute for real baling, this whalebone here, much later on was what became known as feather boning, where they would actually take the quills of feathers, they'd cut the flews off, and then bind the quills all together, and it becomes an inexpensive, not as successful imitation of the whalebone. It would have the same flexibility and strength, but it wouldn't, it would dry more easily and wouldn't take as much strain. Now, again, for equal opportunity here, this is the blue boy, of course. My important issue with this one is the plume in his hat. She gets more. This is, the last one is Gainsborough. I think this is Reynolds. I'm not sure. Anyway, by this point in history, the very wide skirts of the 18th century had become narrowed, and the emphasis was on height. So instead of width being important, the height was important. So they get rid of the animal parts in the skirt, but they add them to the hat or whatever other ornaments in the hair. A single plume, I think I might have a slide of that next. These are referred to as panache. And if you wear something with panache, it means you wear it with bravado, with attitude and so on. And almost, in most of the illustrations I've seen, they almost always seem to be white, although I think I've seen them in pastels. But that's essentially what that's going to look like. They were valuable, of course, because they were exotic and imported into Europe as well. So there's that, the shipping charge. They are called panache because of the cockade worn on the sides of military helmets. And if you wore something, if you had a panache on the side of your helmet, it was meant actually to taunt the enemy. So you've got attitude. Ha ha, you can't hit me. Just as the bullet goes right through your forehead, of course. But so women started to wear these ornaments often as some sort of sympathetic gesture towards the men in their lives who were in the military. This here is the end of the 1790s. This was also made more popular in Europe as well because the Napoleonic armies had invaded Egypt, and they were exposed to the tomb decorations and the carvings in walls of temples and so on, seeing processions of ancient Egyptians with a headband with an ostrich plume sticking out of it. And this became a popular novelty in France and then spread throughout Europe. Exactly the same progression that happened in the 1920s after the opening of King Tut's tomb and the cliche of the flapper with the feather. That's where that's coming from. This is 1820. This is a Gilray cartoon. And I just thought, because everybody's always going to blame women for wearing corsets and whatnot, that's a guy putting a corset on. So just to make the point that, again, it's an equal opportunity, and the corset would have been absolutely stiffened with whalebone. There were other options. They used reed, they used metal to a certain degree, but the whalebone, as I described before, was the principal option. I didn't have any examples of ivory carved teeth, but I have two books on the history of false teeth. People give me the most amazing things. And I thought it would be just something appropriate to mention in passing. I talked about carved ivory for handles, for fans and things like that. But to create artificial teeth, oftentimes they carved ivory pieces down and then fitted them into the head in some way or another. And just to talk about the exploitation of animals, the human animal as well. During wars, and it happened during the Napoleonic Wars, but it also happened during the American Civil War much later. After a battle had been fought, there would be scavengers who would go through the battlefields and pull all the teeth out of the bodies. And then they would send them off and sell them. And people would actually have them implanted into their jaws. And Lady Hamilton, the wicked Lady Hamilton, who was Lord Nelson's mistress, was apparently desperate for money when she was a young woman, and she was on her way to the dentist. She had an appointment with someone who was going to have a tooth pulled. And when you had a tooth pulled, you would pay someone to donate one of their teeth. So you'd have your tooth pulled, they would get one pulled out, and you'd put it in right away so that the gum would presumably heal around it. And that's what she was up to. And she ran into a friend in the street who said, "I'm going to a party, why don't you come?" So she went to the party instead, and that's where she met Nelson. Apparently. I mean, I don't know how much credibility these stories have. But if anybody's interested in these books, I can give you the ISBN numbers. They're really good. The teeth that they were scavenging from the American Civil War, the teeth were being sent to Europe by the barrel. So, I mean, it's really... So it's not just the human being exploiting animals, other animals, but exploiting the human being as well. So, here is the parasol, which is comparable to this one. So that is, and you can see right there it actually has a crooked handle. But the same kind of thing exactly with the carving and so on. So when we have finished with the slides, I'll show you the structure inside. That's the end of the 1820s. A lot of times the hats were also supported with whalebone inside them, the bonnets and whatnot, to give the brim the right shape, as well as wire, of course. This is, I can't remember specifically, but it's the Queen of Spain. And there she has bird of paradise ornaments in the back of her head. I don't know how many of you came to the opening, but we showed a hat with a huge display of bird of paradise. In fact, we showed two. They are fabulous creatures, physically very beautiful. So of course the plumage is spectacular, which made them a tremendous target. And they were hunted for decades to the point of near extinction. I said it again, extinction. And they have been on the endangered species for some time. Some of the subgroups are not considered endangered anymore, but the whole concept of hunting them as trophy is discouraged. I also thought it was interesting that she has real feathers, and then just to add insult to injury, she has a few feathers made out of diamonds. So, in fact, she has just about everything made out of diamonds. Actually, that's why we did a series of lectures on the history of jewelry, and that's why I took that slide in the first place. How can she look so sort of simpy with all that jewelry all over her? Now, this is where I wanted to comment on coral, and that's not coral, it's gold. But that's all right, because we've got another one. There we are. So, as I said, coral, I brought examples just to illustrate this concept. Generally, this is going to be the mid part of the 19th century, sort of 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and you can see that that color matches. And this is the most desirable color for coral. It comes in many different colors and tints and shades and so on, but quite remarkable. Especially on a plain black dress, absolutely dynamite. But if you want something like this, buy fake or antique. Don't go looking for the modern. It's not necessary, and it's illegal anyway, as well as immoral. So, little straight handle parasol with the ivory handle on the top. We've got it upside down there, but there you see the parallel. And almost invariably there will be a little ferrule on the end there with a ring. And presumably you can slip your finger through that and carry it that way, which is why 99% of these that survive, the ring is broken. If you get my drift, you're not going to pick it up with that, are you? No. Excellent. In fact, that one you should let me help you with it. So this one I wanted to just remind myself to tell you, of course, how many ivory fans. Just thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And it's a very inappropriate raw material in many ways, because if you drop it, it breaks. And fans are one of those things that you do drop. They're loose, they're mechanical, they will slip and so on, so you can have real problems with them. The ivory, any large piece of ivory, you'll be able to see the flow of the grain. If it's bone, it will have little pits in it for the most part. So there is a difference, and the aesthetic difference is telling you. It's not as appealing. The bone ones are not nearly as satisfying to the touch or to sight. Tiger claws made into jewelry. This is again, and this is more about animal magnetism to a degree, because there is a direct association with power and fear, maybe, this idea of this wild, ferocious animal, beautiful, but fierce and independent and cannot be denied. And for a man to wear such a thing as part of his watch fob or whatever, there is that sense of association that you're just as wild and woolly. Although this is in fact an earring meant to be worn by a woman. So it doesn't mean that a woman wouldn't enjoy that same fantasy as well as having power. You can still buy these, but they're almost always plastic nowadays, which is fine. Now, I put that in to remind myself about a couple of other things. I think it's because of the next slide. But if we're going to talk about animal magnetism, this one's a little bit sort of questionable, and you have to fantasize whether or not this is valid. In the 1850s and 60s, women wore skirts that were enormously large. This was partly about a society which was wealthy. They could afford a lot of fabric. It was also about a social idea that women should be, women of privilege anyway, should be isolated and set apart and seen as the ornamental object, things like that. They were also trying to hide the fact that women had legs. You could understand that people were animal, but the one thing that we don't have control over, that we still have to admit we're animal, is about sex. When I was in my 40s, I asked my mother why my parents had never talked to me about sex when I was a child, and she said, well, we had cats. And as far as she was concerned, that was all I needed to know, because the cat would get pregnant and the miracle of birth would happen in front of us. So it was a bit peculiar, but she was brought up with Victorian attitudes about such things. So this idea of hiding the body, it is, to a degree, I guess, it heightens mystery and that sort of thing. But if we're talking about animal magnetism, at the end of the 1860s, the big hoop skirts disappeared, and they took the bulk of the fabric and pulled it back up and draped it up into a bustle pad, which the result of is, terrible English there, the result of that is that she's got her bum in the air all the time. And there were people at the time, in a very, very limited way, who thought that this was her advertising. She was being provocative as an animal, as a female animal in heat would be, where she wanders around crying plaintively, looking for love. And there was an argument, a very minor argument at the time, because for the most part, you couldn't say such a thing in public or even in literature without serious censure. So that little bit lean forward could be interpreted that way. So this is a bustle pad of this period. The illustration we looked at was at the very end of the 1870s, actually 1881, but this aesthetic goes from 1878 to 1882 or 83. In this instance, the boning, which should be whalebone, but by this time it could be a cheaper product, would have steel. These tapes here are actually soft. We've got them wired for an exhibition here. They tie right around the legs and keep the legs tied together. At the end of each of these, there's a belt. You can see the buckle there. That goes in behind the leg, and it causes the boning to bow out, and that's what's going to support the back of the skirt. So this is yet another application for the use of whalebone. The whales never had a chance, you know. I mean, they're, and also, when we were talking about animal magnetism, I really didn't know how to deal with the subject of scent, because that is, you know, pheromone traps and things like that. This is part of animal magnetism. The term animal magnetism was actually coined by Mesmer, the person who was famous for mesmerizing and things like that, hypnotism. And he was sort of describing, I couldn't quite make out, we looked it up actually, sort of the magic that goes on between animals and so on, silent communication and that sort of thing. Anyway, and not only did they hunt the whales for baleen, but for ambergris, which was the basis of so many perfumes. So there's the bustle at its biggest point. Well, sort of, this is 1883. By 1886, on occasion, it said that the bustle could be 36 inches deep. So again, that requires a certain kind of superstructure in there to give it that support and so on.
They would never sit down.
Well, actually, there were ways to sit down. Thank you for the leading question. I can use that. In some instances, the bustles were actually made with hinges. So the bustle would come down like this and out like this. And the hoops were on hinges. So that when you went to sit down, you'd lift the top one and the whole thing would fold into the small of the back. Also, women's chairs have appeared. There's a whole history on chairs and fashion, the relationship, because if you had hoop skirts, you couldn't sit in a chair that had arms. So women's chairs of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s have arms that are only that high, so that you can sit down and display yourself well. In the 1870s and 80s, it's much more likely that the chair will have support across the shoulder blades and then an open space below, just above the seat. So when you sit down, you stick your bum out of the back of the chair. So there were ways of dealing with these eccentric styles. That's an actress. I just put that in just to show you the severity of corseting and the unnatural form there. And if any of the women think they have big hips, that's seen as an asset there, no pun intended. But that is about exaggerating the figure. And as far as they were concerned, the bigger the hips, the smaller the waistline looked, and the small waistline was really the focus. But also because of the corseting, she can't sit casually. You can see that the corset is dictating her posture. Now, I put that on, this in. This is supposedly appropriate for an older woman in the 1890s. I put this in just to remind myself to say that up until this time, for the most part, fur was used as trim, not for fur coats as we would understand that. Fur had always been very valuable. Madame de Pompadour, Louis XV's mistress, when she heard that Quebec had fallen to the English in 17 whatever it was, 56 or something like that, who knows? Okay, good, we're all bad Canadians. Anyway, somehow she heard that this had happened, and she said, oh, it doesn't matter, the only value in Canada is to supply me with fur. So that was the attitude. But starting in about 1895, 1900, fur starts to take on more importance as entire garments are made of it. And it's partly because in the earlier periods, if you wore a garment made entirely out of fur, you'd lose the shape. The silhouette was so important in earlier styles. And if you try to wear a fur jacket or coat over something like a hoop skirt, you require 4 or 5 times the amount of fur. For the most part, they wore shawls and stools, and large pieces of fur were restricted to fur rugs for carriages. And you would get in, and then you would cover yourself with the fur blanket, rather than actually wearing it as part of your costume. So this gal here has a fur scarf around her shoulders. probably not attached to her cape, but it is conceivable that this is starting about then. Just to make the point about fur, this is the 1890s, this is Montreal, and I guess it's just illustrating the fact that if animals are killing each other, it's all right if we do. So they're obviously a company which is going to be quite happy to sell sealskin and polar bear products, including the baby polar bears there, of course. And here we have entire coats made out of fur. These are for men. This is Eaton's mail order catalog printed in Winnipeg in 1910, the winter of 1910. And you can see there are 4 different varieties just on that one page of the same product. I have 2 or 3 of these. I used to find them about once every 6 or 8 months in the thrift stores, but that's long gone. But, you know, if you're against hunting fur, and I am against hunting animals for trophy and for fashion and so on, but if you're living in Winnipeg or Churchill, Manitoba or someplace like that, and it's February the 30th and it's 40 below outside, you're quite happy to have that fur coat on. I had to put that in because I love the slide so much. She looks like she's been drinking absinthe or something or other, just too much here. But that feather hat is just something else. I mean, how can you wear such a goofy hat and have such a somber expression? It's beyond me. But anyway, this photograph was apparently dated 1900. I would have put it just a tiny bit earlier, but it's not unreasonable that she's wearing last year's coat or what have you. But eccentric hats were probably the most important application of feathers. This is one of Claus's photographs. This was taken in München in Munich. This is about 1904 or 5, and this is somebody's Oma, somebody's grandmother, and she's wearing a feather boa here. Boas go back a long while, and the fact that they're called boas is another animal reference, because boas are snakes. They are worn, as far as I know, the first time they appear in mainstream fashion is in about 1800, 1810, with neoclassical fashion. And they like them sort of winding around the body. It gave it a sort of a primitive kind of flavor, and they were dealing with, the inspiration came from the ancient Greek world, so this kind of primitive overtone was valuable to them. Generally speaking, though, feather boas of this period are worn as scarves. In other words, they're not draped into the crooks of the elbow. They're worn around the scarf, the neck, and they hang more or less straight down the front. Oftentimes actually meant to fall off the fullness of the chest, to draw attention to the chest. Here's another illustration, and this woman is wearing a chicken feather or some sort of domestic feather boa here. She is holding it back, but that's because we're trying to illustrate the garment that she has on rather than the accessory. Now, I don't know what my next slide is offhand, but this is the mid-Edwardian period. The Edwardian period essentially is 1800 or 1900 to 1914. And in this period, for the most part, the women padded their chests. They wore very tight corsets that created a flat stomach and a massive chest, which is referred to technically and accurately as the pouter pigeon chest. The silhouette should look like that proud chest of a bird. Now the bird has that chest there because it needs the musculature to assist with flight. But for a woman, of course, she's in the marriage market. She is showing her stuff. Although you must admit, when you see the pigeons wandering around so proudly, you think that perhaps they're doing the same thing. And both hats are trimmed with feathers. This is 1906, so this is a year or two later. The hats are getting bigger. There's a political change going on in the background here. Women couldn't vote still. And the ambition to vote was becoming stronger and stronger. And one of the ways this manifests itself is that the garments themselves actually get more modest, and the volume of the skirt in particular starts to decrease. The hats get bigger and bigger, which means the eye is drawn to the face. And this is more about character and intelligence and personality than it is about the overall physique. So this is a political influence changing these roles. This is, whatever this is, 1908. So as I say, something like this could be as early as, I suppose, 8, but 9 to me. And look at the wings. Now those wings on that one hat could be true wings, or they could be built up from loose feathers and that form created. And by increasing the size of the hat, you do notice the face more and more. This is the classic hat style for this period. This is out of a magazine called Chic Parisien, printed, it masquerades as French, but it's actually printed in Vienna. And in the exhibition at the far end, there's an enormous black hat with ostrich feathers, the weepers that I suggested, and it's in this style. Only the basic hat is beaver felt rather than straw. Down here you see the back view of it. So you can imagine if there are 4 or 5 of these built-up plumes on top of that, what a hat like that could have sold for in its day. There was one of these that sold on American eBay 3 or 4 years ago. It went for $1,700. White, though, that was the catch, because you never find them in white. For one thing, if they have survived, they're usually filthy dirty, so they're not useful. French actress, this is a promotional shot for her career. The dress losing its value, the hat becoming bigger and bigger. And by this time, they are killing the birds en masse. It is highly profitable. So greed is always an important thing. The concept of conservation, preservation, completely gone. No one cares. I'm sorry I've put it in backwards. The one on the top left-hand corner at the moment is the one I really wanted to draw attention to. It has these rather eccentric, curving feathers coming out of the top. The rest of them, this is feathers here. The rest of them, it seems to be more silk. But this was the most appropriate one that I had to illustrate the fact that these fashions were universal. This is a page out of the Woodward's mail order catalog from 1909, printed in Vancouver. I have collected in Vancouver since 1965. In all those years, I have found 2 hats of this style that were worn in Vancouver. They don't survive. The Burnaby Village, the Irving House Museum in New Westminster has 2 that were worn in New West. So this is the egret feather. So that's what that would be, only they've been tinted yellow, and obviously there's a lot of them there. Now, this is not a feather ornamented hat, but I just wanted to make the point. This is out of Punch magazine, printed in England. This is 1909 as well, and it says, "Mad as a Hatter, the Autocrat," who is the title of, which is the title of the salesperson here. The Autocrat says, "I assure you, madam, the effect is charming, most absurd and grotesque." And the customer, who is described as the victim, says, "Oh, very well. If you're sure it's all that, I will decide on this one." She wants it because it is absurd and grotesque. People will notice her. Look at the boyfriend. Not too happy. He's the one who's going to have to deal with the teenage boys laughing at her, defending her honor, or throwing mud at her, or something rather. Now, to the point of true absurdity, this is also out of Punch magazine, same issue, Winter Fashions for 1908-1909. And this is meant to make fun of this concept. It's presumably a mother and daughter, and they're out shopping. The mother, sealskin fur was extremely popular for capes and little collars and muffs and all sorts of things. So in this instance, her turban is in fact a real seal. Taxidermed, but it would be a real seal. Her neck piece is another seal. Her muff is a domestic house cat with a fringe of dead mice. The daughter has taken the tiger skin rug from in front of the fireplace. The head is her hat. Her stole are the front legs of the animal, the back legs hanging down, and her muff is a lynx with a dead rabbit in its mouth. This is meant to be amusing, of course, but it is, in fact, a reflection on reality. In the 1880s, when they wore the big bustles, there was a novelty for young women in Britain to wear evening dresses, which would have been all white lace and net and so on, and sometimes decorated with stuffed kittens, real kittens, because they thought it looked cute and charming. A bit bloodthirsty, but there's only a reference in Cunnington's book on that particular option. I've never seen one illustrated in a magazine or a book of the period, but it said it was a short-lived novelty to have real kittens, stuffed kittens on your... Sounds like Dame Edna, doesn't it? So, I think that one was a blank spot when I... No, here we are. At the end of 1912, there's a pronounced turn towards what they saw as Orientalism in fashion. And here we see garments which are actually styled after kimonos. So wrapped around the body very tightly with an obi style of sash. The hats become much more modest, but the more eccentric the ornament, the better. So again, that's where we're going to see things like this object here, more modest in that it could easily just be one rather than a whole cluster of such ornaments, and often dyed eccentrically or clipped eccentrically to give it a sign of sort of what they would have thought of in Europe as an exotic appeal. So you can see that one in particular, the backward curve of it. And as I suggested with the man's fur coat, the whole idea of fur now becoming more and more appealing. Now this is a new kind of silhouette. The garment can cling to the whole body, so it's perfectly reasonable to try and do this with fur. If you'd done it with a much larger, fuller garment, the weight, the volume would have just made you look like a mountain rather than a woman. So this is Chinchilla. Chinchilla is also not a very good fur. Excuse me, the skins are very, very soft and they will tear very easily. Soft, absolutely fabulously soft, but not very appealing. So this is First World War, dress trimmed with fur. And this, when this whole Oriental fascination starts just before the First World War, the idea of trimming dresses with what they think of as Oriental, meaning things like fringes, metallic laces, things like that, and certainly the use of fur. That's all part of this. This is 1917. This is probably about 1918, 1920. This is a photograph taken in Burnaby. And now you really do see conspicuously dead animals with the head and the feet and all of this sort of stuff. And that option is going to continue to be popular until, well, into the early 60s, I suppose. So you can get good mileage out of these things, but good Lord, you know, it really is. And this is about, I think, to a certain extent, sort of the sense of barbarism. The man that goes, the caveman that goes off with the club and kills something, beats it to death, and then brings it home to the wife and says, see what a strong hunter I am, see how much I value you. Cook it. Just horrible. Worst possible taste. I mean, not just the fur, but everything, the combination is sort of like, let's go into the house and see what costs the most money and wear it all. Okay, lost one there, I guess, but okay. Anyway, this is the real application of the dead animal. It's a white fox here. The dress was made in St. Boniface across the river from Winnipeg in 1924, worn by the mother of the bride. So this is how she would have worn that. The dead animal is about status to a degree. The fact that it's white is going to mean it's more expensive. For the aesthetic of the period, though, they tended to wear them exactly as you see it here to fill in the narrowness of the neck. They wanted the whole figure to be sort of a big rectangular form. And you do that with sorry, excuse me, sort of filling in the extremes. This is by an English designer, Lucille, who was Lady Duff Gordon in real life, and another absolute catastrophe. My God, could anything be uglier or less complimentary? Anyway, Lucille and her husband survived the sinking of the Titanic, which is a bit unfortunate. Now, this is where I was going to actually talk about the popularization of Egyptian things after the opening of King Tut's tomb. This is the early part of the 20s. In the winter of 1922-23, they opened the tomb and they started to bring out some of the great treasures from ancient Egypt. One of the sidelights of that was the sudden popularization of ostrich fans. Again, this was something that had been seen as popular in the ancient world, usually not folding fans. And in the tomb, there were ostrich fans that had survived. Once the tomb was opened, they started to deteriorate, so they didn't last indefinitely. But that concept in the sense of exoticism and romance and glamour and wealth, all of those things created this passion for these enormous ostrich feather fans. And usually they're in colors and meant to coordinate with the outfit. Their sense would be that she was supposed to look like an ancient Egyptian temple dancer. Monkey fur. This is in keeping with this sense of exoticism, this fascination with things Egyptian, although it's a bit of a stretch geographically, but it's the exotic, the unknown, sort of forbidden elements here which are important. Art Deco, the end of the 20s, this is 1928, 1929, and fur being shaped into these chevrons here, so an Art Deco form over an Art Deco style of body. This is Woodward's mail order catalog, printed, see North Shore News, so printed in North Vancouver, but for Woodward's downtown. These catalogs were meant to service the logging communities, the fishing villages, the farming communities throughout the province. So everybody gets to be chic, I suppose. The 30s, Eaton's, Winnipeg. You could still buy full fur coats, but they were expensive. The Depression. So for the most part, what is being sold are wool coats with fur trims, especially around the shoulders and throat. And the better ones, you can see it says all with chamois lining. So they'll have inexpensive skin lining inside the garment, and that's what's going to keep the wind from destroying you, but much more modest and much more economical, $16 each. Fancy street photograph, downtown Vancouver, wartime 40s. She's got her dead critters, and rather proud of them. You can see that she's all done up. She feels that she's looking pretty good, I think. If any of you has any old fancy photographs, the Museum of Vancouver collects them. So they would be very happy to talk to you if you don't want to keep them anymore. Second World War, this is a French fashion shot here of a hat. During the war, fur coats, if you could afford such a thing, tended to be very blocky and full because shoulder pads were the silhouette of the day. But for feathers, the extreme application was frivolous hats. In many of the countries involved in the war, conventional clothing, the things that you would wear on your body, were restricted by government limitations, but millinery wasn't. So if you wanted to indulge in some way, you still had to use coupons or vouchers or whatever, but you could go crazy with the hat. And a lot of times this is when the big old hats were taken apart and the parts recycled. So in this instance, she has, I think she's trying to look like bird of paradise elements there, but I think they're pheasant feathers. 50s, craziness. There's a turquoise blue one in the far gallery here. It's decorated with duck feathers. fur bits, fake fur bits. Fake fur is not new. And leopard print. I thought I had a slide of it, but I guess I don't. But in the mid part of the 18th century, the very elaborate French silks would usually show in their pattern floating garlands of flowers and ribbons worked into the patterning of the weave, and lace as well. And in some instances, they actually had intertwined with all of that strips of what appears to be leopard fur. It was always exotic. It was always provocative in terms of glamorous and mysterious and the power of the animal and so on. But mixed in with flowers and lace, it's a bit peculiar. But you should just understand that the fascination with leopard is not new. It's not unique to the 1950s and 60s and Fredericks of Hollywood. It is, in fact, a very old concept. At the same time, artificial fur is also very, very old. As soon as they were able to create some form of velvet, it was only a fraction of an inch away to make it a bit longer. And I do have a dress from the 1870s that is silk taffeta and silk fuzzy stuff, which is meant to look like fur. And I've seen others as well. And certainly, even in the Renaissance, they were making artificial fur because fur was expensive. So it's not unreasonable that they would try to imitate it. So crocodile, alligator, one of the larger reptiles anyway. This is 1959. An entire coat made out of ostrich feathers here. The original Costume Museum Society, now SMOC, has a dress by Norel from 1959, which is what this year is, and that is a garment by Norel. And the dress is a flaming red cocktail length with ostrich feathers that deep, like this, all around the bottom. And then there's a matching red ostrich feather cape, which is about that long and about 8 feet, that deep and 8 feet long. Part of the same series as this, this garment here. Now, I didn't have a slide that illustrated these little flower pot hats in feathers. So the best I could do was these. People always think these are from the 50s, at least in a vintage clothing store they will say that. They're not. This is 1964. The fur hood. This is great in the prairie again. I got out of high school in '64, and these were just starting to become popular for the girls. The guys had to freeze. But now they're impossible to find because most people threw them away. I think this is Yves Saint Laurent, 1964. And the dresses are so simple in the mid-60s that texture is important. So in this instance, they've taken ostrich feathers with colored tips to create this whole fabric thing here. And it works. I mean, she looks wonderful. One of the things about feathers and fur in fashion is that it provokes the desire to touch. And that in itself can be a kind of power. I think the most successful illustration of that is an Angora sweater. A woman wears an Angora sweater, some guy wants to put his hands on her. Just wondering if they should make Angora sweaters for guys. Maybe that would have great value. So I put this in just to bring attention to the end of the 60s, the beginning of the 70s, and the whole counterculture movement, and an entirely different approach about animals and the responsibility of the human being to look after them. I don't know when it happened, but I remember hearing a few years ago now that someone was once again editing the Bible and rewriting it. And the phrase that says, "and man shall have dominion over the animals," was to be changed and say, man was to have the custodianship of the animals, which I thought was an important change. But it still went on. Early 70s, midi-length skirt here, doing the sort of Dr. Zhivago look. And if you can, you can't see her hat, but it's a big Russian-style toque of fox fur. And this is Yves Saint Laurent from the end of the 70s, but it was the hat I wanted to show. So she's sort of dressed in a sort of a tartar look here, or the Hun or something or other. I think that's what it's supposed to be. But the hat is just an enormous big ball of black fox fur. We got into the 80s, I had to do something that was silly. These are by Danier Leather here in Vancouver. They're old enough now that people are starting to look at them with sentiment and positive reactions again. But for the last 20 years, everybody's going, oh, shoulder pads, how ugly. But this is leather, and presumably you can at least justify this more readily because the animals that have died were animals that were being used for food rather than just for their pelts or for their feathers or what have you. And ending with Princess Diana there, wearing an ostrich feather plume in her cap, just as we did with the Blue Boy 200 years earlier. Yeah. So, what goes around comes around, and at least with ostrich, as I say, you don't have to kill them. So, anyway, this was more about animals in fashion rather than lust and desire and true magnetism, but I hope that was of some interest to you and some amusement. So if you want to come and have a look at things, you are welcome to do so.